I waited patiently for the Lord, and the Lord turned to me and heard my cry, lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire, set my feet on a rock, gave me a firm place to stand. The psalmist cries out in Psalm 40. Friends, my name is Reverend Yvonne Gilmore, and I have the privilege of serving as Interim Administrative Secretary of the National Convocation and Associate General Minister and President. I'm so grateful that we are joined tonight by Week of Compassion, right? It's our own relief, refugee, and development mission fund in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Friends, we know that Week of Compassion is more than a week, right? It's a marvelous expression of our movement for wholeness, felt, seen, known around the world. Since 1943, in the midst of World War II, beginning with the Wartime Service Fund, Week of Compassion has been at work and having maximal impact on our behalf. I'm so grateful that tonight we are joined by Caroline Hamilton-Arnold, Associate Director for Domestic Response, and our own Arwayne Calhoun, who is Executive for the Office of Evangelism and Congregational Transformation at Disciples Home Mission, a part of our merger staff. He indeed will moderate and give her a more formal introduction, but it is my privilege and honor to welcome you and just to note that how much I look forward to all that we will learn and the possibilities that will emerge as she talks a bit about the ways that National Convocation congregations, right, were impacted through COVID-19 grants from Week of Compassion and all of the ways that Reverend Caroline has been organizing domestic response for folks in Texas and just really all around the country. So we're just so pleased that she's here. And I'm going to turn things over to Reverend Dr. Calhoun.
Hello, disciples. Welcome to the September edition of the National Convocation's Legacy and Vision presentation. Our presenter tonight is the Reverend Caroline Hamilton-Arnold. Caroline's passion is connecting people with the recreative power of the living God. She is also my colleague from the Week of Compassion. She doesn't want me to give you a whole long list of things that she's done, but I'll just tell you this. She holds a master's from Claremont School of Theology. She's one of our dynamic young preachers, and she also holds a BA from the Texas Christian University, one of the institutions I had the pleasure of matriculating through. Caroline enjoys rock climbing, reading, and exploring the many art galleries and museums of Houston, Texas, my hometown. Without further ado, let me turn it over now to our presenter tonight, Caroline. I am looking forward to your presentation, and we are glad that you're here. Amen.
Thank you so much, Reverend Calhoun, and thank you, Reverend Gilmore, for the invitation. A true delight to be with you all this evening. I can't see your faces, but watching the chat as you check in and say you're here, it is lovely to spend this time together. As the Relief, Refugee, and Development Mission Fund for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, Week of Compassion works with partners to alleviate suffering throughout the world. We connect disciples' resources to places of need within three main areas of work. First, emergency relief and disaster response. Second, through refugee assistance, both humanitarian aid internationally and resettlement support domestically. And through sustainable development and community development internationally. We'll take as an illustration to dig into those three areas of work, something that is on many of our hearts and minds and has been recently, and which really touches on all of those areas, and that's the current situation in Haiti. In regards to sustainable development, we have presence in several parts of Haiti where our partners, primarily Church World Service, Growing Hope Globally, and Prosperity Catalyst, are working with local communities for more stable futures. So this includes things like teaching animal husbandry and helping folks access markets for livestock. It means education in crop diversification and soil conservation and other adaptations to a changing climate, especially in a part of the world so vulnerable to natural disasters. And then there's work in other income generating activities like fishing and beekeeping and baking. Much of that work focused especially on economic development and vocational training for women in the community. Alongside that, and in part enabled by that ongoing work, our partners have responded to multiple disasters over the past decade or so, including the 2010 earthquake, Hurricane Matthew in 2016, and the recent earthquake this year. Thanks to the commitment to community resilience and disaster-aware construction, which takes more time and is more expensive. But thanks to those things, we are glad to report that the homes, schools, and other structures that were built after previous disasters fared quite well through this most recent quake with only minimal damage. And the investment of training in local communities meant that there is already a knowledge base among local leaders for further rebuilding from this quake. In response to the current situation, our partners have provided some early relief, including food and first aid kits and assistance with provision of water and hygiene and sanitation support. But the bulk of our resources and the primary focus of our partners will again be on long-term needs. So that's rebuilding homes, providing community-based psychosocial support, especially for folks who have been traumatized now by multiple events in the context of political instability. And then there will also be continued provision of food, water, and hygiene supplies. So you have those responses happening in country in Haiti. And then we also have this intersection with our work with refugees, especially through our support of Church World Service, Disciples Refugee and Immigration Ministries, and the Disciples Immigration Legal Council. And they have pretty robust efforts for advocacy and direct support of Haitians in the US, especially those currently here on temporary protected status from the 2010 earthquake. And just in the last few days, this developing situation at the Texas border as Haitians are unfortunately being deported and being prevented from seeking asylum, which is their legal right to request asylum. Folks who have been displaced by the current political and natural disaster crises, and folks who were displaced in 2016 or 2010 and have been living in Central and South America and have migrated north due to changing political circumstances in those countries. And we're in conversation with our partners about how best to respond to this developing situation as part of the broader context in Haiti. And we do have a link to a Google Doc from one of the local partners that is working with Church World Service that will give you some steps if you want to be part of the advocacy and awareness raising around that current situation on the border. Within all of that work that we do, that breadth of work that we do together as disciples, as church, I have the privilege of focusing on our domestic disaster preparedness and response work, which means I get to work very closely with disciple congregations and communities in preparation for and response to natural disasters in the US and Canada. While every disaster is unique based on the location and community that's affected and the particularity of the event itself, most disasters follow a pretty typical cycle. Before the disaster, you have a period of preparedness. Hopefully you're actually getting prepared during that time. There's the event itself. There's the immediate relief phase, which is really about kind of basic human needs, getting people food, shelter, medication, life-saving kinds of things, and then property protection. Then we go into a period of assessment where we figure out who needs what and how are we going to get it, and who's going to need assistance to recover. And then there's the long-term recovery, which is that actual rebuilding of homes, communities, livelihoods, and our well-being as individuals and as communities. During that first relief phase after an event, Week of Compassion works, I say, to and through disciple congregations. So we have solidarity grants, 3 types of solidarity grants that are for affected households, so disciple households that have been displaced because of evacuation or have had damage at their homes. Congregational solidarity grants for our churches that have damage, and then community solidarity grants, which are really intended to undergird, amplify, encourage relief efforts through our congregations. So that might be ramping up the food pantry so you can serve folks who have been affected by the disaster. It might be helping clean up houses, muck out flooded homes. It might be opening up as a day shelter or an overnight shelter, all kinds of different ways that disciples serve their communities after disaster. And we like to come alongside with staff support, pastoral care, informational connection to our various networks, and then also financial support through these solidarity grants. Just recently, we sent quite a number of these solidarity grants, unfortunately, as we had Hurricane Ida move through Louisiana, affecting many of our disciple congregations, and then causing damage all the way up in the Northeast. So connecting with Hope Church in Bound Brook, New Jersey, and Park Avenue Christian Church, 2 Park Avenue Christian churches in New Jersey and in New York, serving their communities and facing recovery from damage at their buildings and among their congregants' homes. We do also have these solidarity grants for human-caused disasters or just, emergency events, not necessarily hurricane situations. So back in June, there was that firework explosion in South Los Angeles, just a few blocks from All People's Community Center and Church. And so we were able to work with All People's to provide some support to the local community for folks who were displaced by that explosion. A number of you are from congregations that have either received solidarity grants or been in communities that received them because of things like church fires or house fires among our members. So we have that piece of our domestic disaster response. Through that assessment phase, we try to just be a really good channel of information. When there is a federal FEMA declaration, it's just a glut of information. So we try to help distill it, walk people through that process, orient our churches so they can be sources of good information to their communities. And then we are doing our own assessments during that phase. And this is from a month or so after an event until 5-6 months after an event, when hopefully we really start moving forward with long-term recovery. Once we get to that long-term recovery phase, we partner with disciples as well as with ecumenical and community organizations to support that rebuilding of homes, communities, and livelihoods. So that includes grants to what are called long-term recovery groups, which are community coalitions that are leading recovery. It's support and pastoral care to disciples who are in those affected areas, and especially those who are involved in the recovery efforts. And then where it's feasible and where the pieces all come into place, we support volunteer efforts. We help to facilitate both referral to trusted partners and in some situations, the management of volunteer mission sites to receive teams to start doing that repair and recovery work. For example, we have provided grants to community organizations like West Street Recovery in Houston, Texas, which has a project of rebuilding homes, but alongside that, rebuilding some community cohesion and building community power in 4 marginalized, historically discriminated against zip codes that are majority people of color and have seen significant disinvestment from the political and economic powers that be over the past many, many years. And so they are doing, West Street Recovery is doing the kind of physical repair of homes, but then also advocating for more just responses to disaster from city officials. They are advocating for better policies that will better serve their zip codes in future disasters, and they're building community resilience. So when there's a winter storm like we had in February, they know who is going to need a generator because they have a medical need and have to have their equipment still running, who is going to need help with evacuation if there's a power outage or if there's another flood. And they've been building that network within those communities. So that's one place that we've provided some grant support. Support for disciples that are involved in recovery. Great example of this is First Christian Church in Chico, California, part of the Ministerial Alliance in town. After the Camp Fire caused such destruction in their county a couple of years ago, they came together and said, people are going to be grieving this loss, and it's a very particular kind of grief. And so they have been facilitating grief support groups for survivors of that fire, especially as they have experienced new trauma with recurring fires over the past few years. Our volunteer piece is an exciting area of growth for us. Historically, some of you may be familiar with the Disciples Volunteering Mission Stations, and we worked very closely with Disciples Volunteering, and the pandemic and some other circumstances gave us the opportunity to assess the efficiency of those ministries. And it made sense to pull some of those pieces into Week of Compassion. So we will be the ones really facilitating that work. Mostly doesn't change anything for congregations that are involved other than where you send your registration paperwork, but we hope it does streamline things a little bit. We do have a couple of active sites going for disaster recovery support with volunteers. It's been a bit strange with this prolonged pandemic and the sort of start and stop as we've been trying to negotiate how to safely facilitate volunteer opportunities. But we do have sites active in Southwest Louisiana, where they're recovering from Hurricanes Laura and Delta that hit last year. And we have a couple of congregations there that are active in the recovery as well and love to welcome volunteer teams to the area. And we also have an active site in partnership with the Fuller Center Disaster Rebuilders and Camp Caroline in North Carolina. I saw Bishop Melvin had joined the call. Thank you for being here, Bishop Melvin, and thank you for being such a great partner over the last 4 years since Hurricane Florence hit. We're working out in Eastern North Carolina in Pamlico County, a fairly rural area, underserved in terms of the disaster response and recovery presence, but where there's been a really great community collaboration, including the Disciples Camp there at Camp Caroline. And so there are still hundreds of folks working to get their homes repaired and be able to move back home and live in safe and habitable housing moving forward. I see that Brenda dropped in the chat our link to the volunteer page where you can find out more. There's an interest form you can fill out there for our various volunteer opportunities, including some of those that are sort of in development, where we're still in conversation with partners about when and where and how to best show up most effectively for the local community. One of those is a possible collaboration in Dayton, Ohio. We're currently working with Reverend Disaster Ministries in Dayton on a really exciting and innovative project that is taking vacant lots currently owned by the city of Dayton and a couple of other local municipalities, building homes on those lots and making them available as affordable housing units for purchase by first-time homeowners who were renters displaced by tornadoes in 2019. I know that's a lot of moving pieces, but we get to stabilize housing for tornado survivors who have been bouncing from rental unit to somebody's couch to sometimes their car or other unstable housing situations into a situation of stable, affordable, generational wealth creating housing as they become first-time home buyers with the support of several nonprofits in the area. It also stabilizes a community that is still recovering from this tornado and stabilizes neighborhoods that had these vacant lots or dilapidated properties that were owned by the city. And so it's a really exciting project. We really hope to be able to extend that kind of work come January. We're going to take a brief pause while some houses are framed, and hopefully we'll be able to pick back up with volunteers at an ecumenical site in Dayton in January. So keep tuned for more details there. All of that is after the disaster happens. We also try to devote time and energy and resources to preparing congregations before disasters happen, promoting preparedness and the ability to respond well. So we have trainings available. We have a congregational preparedness guide, a recorded version of our webinar, which is a 1-hour kind of orientation to disaster preparedness. And we have me available to you if you and congregations in your region or your cluster would like to do more in-depth disaster preparedness training. I can come and do that for a half day or a full day. I can't come in person yet, hopefully soon, but can certainly come virtually in this moment to help you think through, how do we protect our people? How do we help them prepare as individuals and households? How do we know who of our folks will need help evacuating? Who of our folks would really suffer during an extended power outage? Who of our folks doesn't have $300 in savings to be able to go put up in a hotel for a couple of nights if there were a disaster event in your area? So protecting our people is one. Protecting our property, our buildings, our assets, our places of worship that we know are so much more than buildings. They're places of sanctuary for people. And so how do we protect those spaces and those centers of ministry to the community? Some fairly easy mitigation can prevent further damage in the event of a disaster and position you better to continue serving your community. Thinking about how we can prepare our processes, our ministries, our kind of organizational structures so that even if we do have a disaster and things are thrown upside down in a moment's notice, we can still do the essential functions of our churches. You all have gotten a crash course in this over the past 18, 19 months. As we've lived through this pandemic, you've had to make those changes, unfortunately, more than once. And so thinking through what learning can we take forward, what of that hard-won wisdom do we want to capture for the future to make us better prepared for the next disaster. And then finally, preparing a little bit about how can we better help our neighbors. I often talk with congregations that I'm working with for preparedness about Pharaoh's dream that Joseph interprets with the fat cows and the skinny cows. And because Joseph and Pharaoh act, because they store up grain during the 7 years of plenty, they have what they need to not only take care of the people of Egypt, but also take care of those who come seeking help from them during the years of famine. And so how can our churches listen to the warnings that we have been given, that disasters will happen in our areas and that our neighbors will have needs? And how can we think about how our congregations are best suited to serve? So we hope to continue having that conversation with more congregations, and hope congregations will take advantage of the resources that are available on our website. Brenda did drop that in the chat as well, weekofcompassion.org/prepare. Finally, I want to acknowledge a bit this series of webinars is Legacy and Vision, which I think is such a lovely way to frame these conversations. And Week of Compassion has been doing this work for over 75 years with and for disciples, as disciples. And it's a remarkable legacy and one that has transformed so many lives. And as with so much that we've inherited, it's a legacy fraught with the racism of our country. And it's a legacy of systems that were built in overt and covert ways to prioritize white disciples. We have not always been accessible or accountable to the full breadth of the church. And we acknowledge that. And we are currently in the midst of a racial equity audit, thanks to a grant from the Orrin E. Scott Foundation, and a review of our domestic disaster ministries, with a vision for the future of this ministry that is more just and more fully a ministry of the whole church. And I share that in part because it's an accountability effort, and in part because your input is crucial to this being a successful move for Week of Compassion. And so I welcome your feedback, your questions. I welcome conversation about how Week of Compassion can better serve your congregations, better connect with your congregations, and adapt our ministries to be a ministry of our whole church. I thank you for being here tonight. I thank you for the ways that you have been serving your communities. Reverend Gilmore mentioned the COVID-19 response, and we provided solidarity grants for individuals who were having financial hardship, as well as grants for COVID-19 relief ministries focused on food security. And we had hundreds of households within our Convocation congregations who received grants through those programs because of the leadership in the congregations that reached out to Week of Compassion and made those connections happen. And there are hundreds and thousands of people who received food, who received assistance, who felt the love of God because of the work that your congregations have done, and that we were grateful to come alongside and support and join in with you to serve your communities, to serve our neighbors across this country. I believe we have Q&A or an opportunity for responses. I talked really fast, so I got through my whole presentation faster than anticipated.
You did wonderfully great. It's amazing. I've been working for the general church, serving the church now 18 years, and I thought I knew what Week of Compassion does, but yeah, you informed me tonight of a whole lot of things that you guys do. Thank you for that. Brothers and sisters, it is now time for you to ask any questions or make comments. If you would, put those in the chat area, and I'm going to monitor those, and we will get to those, to as many of those as we can. We have quite a bit of time, so at this time, Reverend Carolina, say something else that you want to
Sure.
add to what you've done tonight.
I'll highlight that Brenda did drop in the chat a printable one-page flyer about our domestic disaster response, which gives you kind of the highlights of what I sped through this evening, and has contact information for Week of Compassion. So save that, keep it. I know that when a disaster happens, your brain kind of goes into overwhelm mode, normal after a trauma. So having this handy and remembering that Week of Compassion is here and has resources available to you, both to assist your congregants and your congregation, and also to accompany your congregation in serving the wider community. We also, along with the grant support, I relish the opportunity to talk to congregations about what could we do. This is what we're seeing. How could we serve? Who can we connect with? So even if you don't have a ready disaster ministry, I welcome the opportunity to have conversation and help you think about ways that you could serve your community after a disaster. So I will also share that my contact information is on the staff page of the Week of Compassion website. And you are always welcome to reach out to me directly, Caroline@weekofcompassion.org, or by phone or text at 203-772-8597. And both of those, again, are on the Week of Compassion staff page on our website.
Absolutely. Also, as I'm sitting here tracking the comments and traffic, a few of our folks have said a personal thank you to you and to the staff for Week of Compassion for the work that you all do. Indeed, it is life or Christ-giving work. We do have a question here. How can we learn more about that Daytona Housing Program you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, the Dayton Housing Program is called the Tornado Survivors Pathways to Home Ownership Project, which is a mouthful. If you go to our website on the Stories tab, if you search for Dayton, that's the story that will come up first, I do believe. I can share a little bit more about it. We were around tables not long after the 2019 Memorial Day tornado outbreak, and we knew that there were hundreds of rental units that were destroyed in those tornadoes. And so between local community partners who were already working in the sphere of affordable housing, and then disaster recovery partners who are around these tables doing recovery planning during that assessment phase that I mentioned, we started just brainstorming, how can we put a dent in this lack of affordable housing and the need that we know is going to be greater because of this event. And this is sort of what emerged out of the skills and abilities and interest of those local organizations that were already collaborating. The way that it's unfolding is there are a couple of organizations, including the local community college, that are really interested in doing the framing and essentially drying in the houses. So doing the siding and the roofing and all of that, but they don't want to do floors and cabinets and painting. But our volunteers are really good at floors and cabinets and painting and all of that interior work. So the plan, hopefully, if we can pull it off, is to continue with Brethren Disaster Ministries through October. That is certain. And then in January to pick back up, receive teams of 5 to 12 individuals who would work for 3 to 5 days doing interior home repairs. If you want to stay in the loop on that, you can email me directly, or you can fill out the interest form, volunteer interest form at weekofcompassion.org/volunteer.
Absolutely. Can you say more about how congregations can get involved and share in ministry for our Haitian siblings and also our siblings from Afghanistan?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the current deportation situation with our Haitian neighbors, the best thing you can do is raise your voice. So the link that was dropped at the very beginning of this chat session has a toolkit for ways to amplify the issue and call on the Biden administration to approach this moment with compassion and with deference to US and international law regarding asylum seekers. For those who are in Haiti, we have, as I said, ongoing partnerships providing immediate relief and planning for long-term recovery. If you would like to make designated gifts for that response, you can do so at our website or by check, and just put Haiti earthquake in the memo line by check, or select earthquake on the designation for your online gift. 100% of designated gifts are directed to supporting the affected communities. So you can know that your funds will be put to good use. As far as response for our siblings from Afghanistan, that's a twofold response. Humanitarian aid in and around Afghanistan. We have a number of partners that have sustained presence in the region and are providing humanitarian aid. Due to the security situation, we can't publish many details about what they're doing, but know that our partners are active and have longstanding presence in Afghanistan and in surrounding countries. Stateside, there is an enormous need for assistance for resettlement for evacuees, some of whom are on what are called special immigrant visas. Some are on what's called humanitarian parole, which is a terrible phrase, but means that they are given a temporary special status to be in the US, similar to an asylum status. And then there are some who are part of the formal refugee resettlement process. Each of those categories has different levels of support from the federal government. All of them rely to some degree on local communities, especially refugee resettlement offices. We have a page on our website, and I don't remember the URL, but it should be linked pretty prominently on our homepage with a number of resources for how you can get involved locally, both in terms of advocacy and calling on our federal government to provide the necessary funding for resettlement for these neighbors who are here because of us and our activity in Afghanistan, and with actions that you can take to assist families in your area, depending on how close you are to either the military bases that are the first kind of reception center for these evacuees, or the resettlement offices that will be supporting them in the months and years to come. There's a great webinar linked on that page as well that we co-hosted with Refugee and Immigration Ministries.
Absolutely. Sister Linda Barnes asked, can you mention perhaps just a little bit more about the congregational guide?
Yeah.
How congregations or people who are interested might obtain that?
Absolutely. I'm glad you're interested. Our Congregational Disaster Preparedness Guide is available for download as a PDF or a fillable Word document at weekofcompassion.org/prepare. And that is farther up in the chat. It should be fairly prominent. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see it. We also do have that guide available in Spanish if you have congregations or colleagues who may be interested in the Spanish version of that guide. And we have a webinar interpreted into Korean. So if you have colleagues who would like that version, we're working hopefully to get that guide translated into Korean as well.
Okay, absolutely. Brother Richard is asking, was there a mass deportation plan and executed for our siblings who entered through the southern border from Mexico, Central and South America?
I don't know that I can speak to what was planned, but we have been hearing about multiple flights a day of deportation of our Haitian siblings that have arrived at the southern border. So what was knee-jerk and what was planned, I haven't been in those rooms, so I don't know. We do know that our asylum system and that the process for requesting asylum has been woefully inadequate for years and was pretty much dismantled during the previous administration. So the ability to receive the numbers of folks who are coming to legally request asylum, we just don't have the capacity. And we need to have the capacity, but it's unfortunately not there right now. Great.
Can you say more about the psychosocial needs of disaster survivors? For instance, what sustains you amidst the persistence and overwhelming human and natural disasters?
Yeah.
I think I think the person wants to get a little bit more at how you deal with, some of the challenges that we're having at this time.
Yeah, I personally am really grateful to the Pension Fund for launching access to a new platform called Learn to Live, which is self-directed cognitive behavioral therapy-based strategies for dealing with depression, anxiety, insomnia, many of the responses that are normal responses to abnormal situations that we have all found ourselves in over the last year and a half, because we've all been living through a disaster of sorts in this pandemic. I also have a 2.5-year-old, so he brings lots of joy into my life, which sustains me greatly. And I get to see the church embodying the love of God and the presence of Christ in a way that is phenomenal. Disciples show up. I keep thinking we're going to get exhausted and we're going to get burned out because the disasters just keep coming. And yet the generosity of disciples keeps meeting the moment. And that sustains me, seeing the way the Spirit is moving through the community and the movement of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ to meet the needs of our neighbors is extraordinary and very hope-giving and life-giving. To the broader question about psychosocial support after disasters, it's huge and necessary, and we need to talk about it, especially because we all lived through this pandemic. When you go through trauma, which a disaster for most people exceeds our ability to cope emotionally and psychologically. We have been through a trauma of some degree. Our brains go into a fight, flight, or freeze survival mode. We don't process information well. We are highly alert, and we don't stay regulated between our bodies and our brains. And that is, again, a normal response to an abnormal situation. It helped us survive throughout the history of human evolution. And it's exhausting and can lead to a number of unhealthy coping mechanisms and can limit our flourishing of life. So responding to disasters with an eye to psychosocial needs, especially in places like Haiti, where we see compounding disasters, and not just Haiti, in communities that are hit by hurricanes and tornadoes regularly, or communities that were living with the burden of racism and the burden of poverty and or the burden of X, Y, and Z going on in people's own lives. And then they hit a moment of trauma because of a disaster, means their capacity to respond is diminished. And so we as church should be equipped to talk about it openly, refer people to mental health professionals, to hold grief support groups like the church in Chico is part of, to shepherd people through this moment or this period until they're able to process their trauma. And there are all kinds of different ways that people do that. We have psychosocial support for refugees in refugee camps that's very based in gardening and connection with the earth. We have groups that are about kind of talking and sharing stories and making art. We have organizations that we have supported in domestically in response to disaster that are really focused on, okay, how do we use this moment to motivate us to make a difference? That feeling powerless is pretty common when you've been through a trauma. So finding a way that you can make a difference and have a connection with another person can all be very healing. And so finding those opportunities for our churches to plug in can be a beautiful gift to our communities.
Okay, absolutely. You know, just Sister Ann asked a very interesting question. I'm sure many are asking this question, and you know, you kind of have to filter this through in this 21st century time, in this time of varied media. You know, from the ultra conservative to ultra liberal. You know, and depending on where we get our news from and how we filter that. Sometimes, you wonder if things are as they really are. The question is this. Someone said, can you help me understand why the Haitians are being sent back to Haiti and why we haven't seen the same thing happen to other refugees? You have any comment as it relates to that question?
I wish I had a good answer to that question. I would say that there is a distinction between refugees and asylum seekers, in that refugees have been through a process of vetting, first coordinated by the UN and then through 13 or 14 different federal agencies within the US. So they go through a long process before they are accepted to the US, whereas asylum seekers show up at a border, cross a border, and request asylum. So that's part of the distinction. I would also say we've seen other moments of significant human migration where the US has a really bad track record of these same kinds of deportations. And and the same unwillingness to receive asylum seekers. There is a fairly good argument to be made that it's just systemic racism playing itself out in our immigration and asylum systems and processes. There are more generous interpretations that have to do with a lot of complicated international policy and US policy. And I think there are a lot of factors at play in this particular moment that I am not well versed enough to speak to, but
Yeah, absolutely.
I appreciate the question.
Absolutely. Just a couple of things, and we are going to bring our September legacy and vision presentation to a conclusion tonight. Marcia Sams just asked to remind us that folks are in need of hygiene kits, blankets, cleanup kits, and this stuff is being provided and processed through church world services. Also, our Administrative Secretary asked, would like for me to lift up that we have a legacy and vision session with Sharon Stanley Ray, who you work somewhat closely with in DHM, our Director of Refugee and Immigration Ministries, and she will be a part of this process in the future. With that said, Reverend Caroline, thank you so much for agreeing to partner with us tonight. I mean this from the bottom of my heart. Your presentation was very impactful, very informative. As I said earlier, I thought I knew, most of what you did, but you taught this old dog a few tricks tonight. Thank you for being with us tonight and sharing your ministry with us. And also, I might call your attention to the comment section that there were several accolades for you and for Week of Compassion and what you guys do. You are a tremendous gift to the church. And as I say about a lot of our general ministries, you are good at what you do. And thank God for that. And thank God for you. If there is nothing else at this time, Administrative Secretary, is there something you?
Thank you. One, I want to say thank you to you, Reverend Dr. Arwayne Calhoun. And folks, next month, he's going to be our featured guest for Legacy and Vision series, and he's going to be talking to us about evangelism and transformation. So you don't want to miss that. It's the third Tuesday of October, so be here for that. And then certainly just want to also convey my thanks to the Reverend Caroline Hamilton-Arnold. She indeed has the big picture, right? And she's told us about that. But she's on the phone, right? She's on the phone when she can be safely on the ground, right? She's safely on the ground in care for. And so I'm so grateful for how she also communicates with National Convocation to keep us updated on what's going on with our congregations and leaders and the ways. And so we're looking forward together to just strengthening our partnership. And yeah, just so grateful for her leadership and for all that they do with a small staff at Week of Compassion. Giant, amazing things happen, but indeed this is with a small staff. So thank you so much. And also for the Brenda Rossi, who we don't see, but who indeed is with us mightily on tech tonight, as always. So thank you to each of you also for joining us. Blessings. Good night.
Yeah.